Hello, and welcome to our video about the Industrial Revolution and the Second Industrial Revolution. In this video, we'll look at changes to society from the First Industrial Revolution. What is the Second Industrial Revolution? What wave is that? What political ideologies come about because of the Industrial Revolution? And then ultimately, what are the effects we'll see? One of the greatest advancements during this time is going to be the development of railroads. So, railways are going to be built in England, Belgium, France, and Germany. And ultimately, they're used as faster transportation, right? You can take things that are very heavy, move them long distances, and you see the faster movement of people and products. And this is like all from different industrial products, right? We see iron, steel, all things that develop in the Industrial Revolution built to create this massive new transportation network. And you can see how much, railroads will impact transportation. I mean, look at these maps of like what the world will look like in the next, 100 years. We see that it turns to higher consumerism because products are more available, people will buy more things, and it leads to faster communication. By the end of this century, we start to see the emergence of true globalization. I mean, you see on the right hand side railroads that are connecting Europe all the way to China. So we can see the big effects of railroads coming soon. And before we dive into our social changes, it's also important to note that there are some factors that are limiting industrial growth during this time as well. In Southern and Eastern Europe, you see that they have limited resources. They don't have access to those coal and iron resources that the England and Germany and France will. They don't have the same transportation systems. And in Russia, they're largely still in serfdom. Until the mid 1800s. And that means they're largely rural. They don't have a very large urban population. And then we see the effects of things like the Hungry 40s or the potato famine in Ireland that's going to kind of negatively impact, the whole of the Irish people as they don't have access to food that they normally would. And it causes a lot of kind of mass migration into these industrialized cities, which we'll talk about later. Okay, let's look at some changes to society because of the Industrial Revolution. First, we'll see that a lot of rural people are moving into cities. So the process of urbanization is booming. And this population explosion in Europe leads to more people living in very crowded, tough conditions. These aren't places you would like to live. There's not enough housing. The sanitation is very poor. People are squished together, so disease spreads really easily, and crime is high. Because they can't build houses fast enough for families, they start to build these new buildings called tenements, which are basically kind of like apartment buildings, except imagine multiple families all living under one roof. They're crowded, they're dark, they're unsanitary, and they're often dangerous, just overcrowded. At this point in time, there are really no labor laws. So they can ask you to work as long as they want you to work. So most people are working 12 to 16 hours a day. The work is really tedious. You're just doing the same motion at a machine hour after hour. Those machines are dangerous. There's pretty much no safety considerations. And if you were to get hurt, like if you were to lose a hand in one of these machines, it's not like they would still have a job for you. They would tell you you're unemployed now, get out of line. It's a lot of exploitation of the workers and the conditions are just really dangerous. We start to see a rise in child labor during this time period as well. They're exploited for their size. They're small. They can fit in these spaces that adults just can't fit into. They don't really have to pay them nearly as much or at all. There's a rise in the workhouses where they send children to actually like perform physical labor, and they're largely orphans. So there's no one there to protect them. They're given very little food. They're physically abused. They're not sent to school. It's just, a very depressing life. There are some women working in factories as well, but they're mostly going to be young, unmarried women or widows working these low wage skilled jobs because basically, once they got married, that was required of them to run the whole household for everybody. And they usually had a husband that was making more money than them doing the same job, anyways. So most women are at home or working land if you're in a place like France. But if women were working in a factory, it was probably something to do with textiles or something that would be considered like a woman's sphere. There were very clear definitions of what was men's work and what was women's work during this time period. In the early factory system, we actually see that roles in the family stayed pretty close to the same, and those newer machines led to the employment of some of those unmarried women and children in the factories. But overall, wages for skilled laborers became high enough that some children were able to leave the factory and go to school. But later on, we'll start to see that wages stay pretty stagnant and even lower with cost of living increases. So that'll change. So women in the working class, they would leave the workforce and go live with their husbands, and they would live off of his earnings once they got married. But what they're really trying to model is this thing called the cult of domesticity, which was popular amongst the middle and upper classes. And it's just this idea that there's like four main virtues for women. It's like piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. So the idea that the woman's role is in the private sphere, managing the household, raising children, supporting her family, and the public sphere where work and politics happen, that's all like the men's world. There are changes to labor systems as well during this time period. So the guild system, which we've talked about before, it's an association of merchants or craftsmen that offer kind of protection to their members and set rules and guidelines about the things they produce. Those are going to be challenged during this time period. The industrialists, the factory owners, they don't really like the guild system because they limit the types of things that they can do. One thing we start to see more of, though, is this thing called confection goods. So just the idea that there are standard sizes to goods like shoes, like you have sizes for shoes now, and it leads to kind of like mass production of goods and more division of labor. So you may have been wondering to yourself, are all these really negative things going to come from industrialization and people in charge are going to do nothing to help those people? Well, the answer to that is they do a few things to help these people. So the English Factory Act of 1833 forbids the employment of children under 9 and limits the working day to 9 hours for children between the ages of 9 and 13. So they're doing something. These children, you don't have to work till you're 9. Oh my gosh. There's an education requirement that gets input into factories. So they have to provide at least 2 hours of education for the children working there. So that's something. The 10 Hours Act passes a 10-hour workday. And then the Mines Act of 1842 forbids women and children under the age of 10 from working in mines. So, you have to be 11 before you can go dig for coal. Another change for this time period is the growth of crime during the Industrial Revolution. And one of the things that we see kind of across history is that when people are in close proximity to each other, when people can't get like jobs that are steady enough to provide for their family, we see crime rates rise, especially in cases like theft. And so that's what's happening here. We see a lot of cases of theft and arson during this time period. So the idea that you need a standing police force to keep people safe and like protect property and lives, that's a new idea to have like actual police patrolling the streets. You usually wouldn't do that. You would have like police officers that would, be in charge of regions, more like a sheriff sort of situation. But now we've got actual police that are around to help the people. So like in England here, that's an example on the right of the bobbies that come in 1829. And the other side of that whole process is that you have to have well, how do you create order when you have increase of crime? So they do a lot of prison reform. And so instead of everyone, being housed together regardless of your crimes, they start to send serious offenders abroad. So that's when they start sending people to like Australia to penal colonies. And then they start to decide like maybe the goal of prisons shouldn't just be to punish people that did something wrong. Maybe they should actually have some sort of reform element to them. So they try to do that, though it doesn't, totally work. They try to teach them skills or a trade, but often that leads to like lots of outsourced of labor, like work camp sort of stuff. So they try to reform, but it is what it is. So there's really no better kind of image to show you than the Crystal Palace when we think about how much Britain is able to accomplish in this like 50-year time period. So the Crystal Palace was built to be an exhibition in London in 1851 to basically show off the new prestige and wealth of the British. So it's made out of iron and glass just to show how abundantly cheap these materials can be for British people now, and it shows off to the world. I mean, at this point in time, Britain's producing two-thirds of the world's coal and more than half of all iron and cotton cloth. And so they're about 20% of the entire world's output of industrial goods at this point in time, where 100 years ago, it was about 2%. So you can see that Britain's making these giant leaps ahead of everybody else, and this is their way to show off. And this really brings us to the second industrial revolution. It's also just known as the second wave of the Industrial Revolution, but when we talk about it, this is what it's defining. It's talking about chemical industries, electricity, utilities, leisure travel, sports. These are the defining factors. It pretty much takes all of the initial foundations of the first wave of the Industrial Revolution, and then they build off of that to create all this massive change in technology. One of those big changes is going to be the Bessemer steel process. So they find a way to make steel and they make it very efficiently. And steel is lighter and stronger than iron. And this leads to all sorts of new technology. And this is where we start to see the development of mass production. So things that are built to be a standard size with interchangeable parts, the development of the assembly line, and all of this leads to higher production, meaning that we can buy goods for cheaper prices because there's just more in the market. And here are some of those standout industrial revolution inventions that kind of made a big impact on people. Most of them we see have several that are to do with transportation and communication. Those are going to be the primary kind of like life-changing things for people during this time period. Which brings us to political changes that will happen because of industrialization. The first movement we'll see is British Charterism, which emerges in 1836 and is most active between then and 1848. And the aim of Chartists was to gain political rights and influence for the working class. And some of the things that they want the ability to vote for all men over 21, not just property holders. They want to be able to be a representative, like a member of parliament, an MP, they want you to be able to like have a paycheck for being an MP. So more working class people could actually hold elected offices. Before those were unpaid positions, so only wealthy people could do it. All of this kind of culminates for like 10 years and then ends in 1848 without them getting really any of those concessions. And then there's this thing called the Corn Laws. So the Corn Laws were a series of tariffs and trade restrictions imposed by the British government between 1815 and 1846 that regulated the import of grain. And corn, they just used it as a general term for grain. And they passed this after the Napoleonic Wars, and they're trying to protect British landowners and farmers by letting them be the main people bringing in grain. So it's expensive to import cheaper foreign grain. So this benefits landowners a lot, but it hurts the working class and the urban poor who have to pay a lot of money for that same grain. So the repeal of the Corn Laws is driven by growing pressure from industrialists and free trade advocates, especially the Anti-Corn Law League, which argued that cheaper food would benefit workers and support industrial growth. And the final push came after the Irish potato famine when widespread hunger made food imports more urgent. So this is a really big win for the working class. And then because of the unique conditions created by the Industrial Revolution, where you see kind of wide distribution of wealth, equality, all these different things, we get different like ideologies that develop because of this. So like utilitarianism created by Jonathan Bentham, the idea that the greatest good for the greatest number of people is what we should value in a society. Or ideas about socialism, that a collective ownership of property is the best way to move forward, or even Marxism, the idea that the proletariat, the workers, should be the ones in charge of labor, not these, factory owners. So we see kind of pushback on the abuses of the industrial system. And then finally, what are some of the overarching effects of the Industrial Revolution? One of the biggest takeaways is that we will see the development of new and set social classes developing in Britain. So we see the working class, the middle class, and then the Nueve Riche, the new rich people. So people that invested in factories or owned them. We also see an altered family structure. So we went from families working together in the cottage industry to now having very clearly defined roles that they're really not allowed to break from. As people start to classify themselves in these new social classes, things become more and more reinforced through the associations and unions that develop. So these upper middle class to like rich people, they create clubs and associations that they're all members of. And that's how they kind of like interact with each other. And then the proletariat or the workers, they're going to form unions to try to kind of like gather their resources and protect their rights. We also see new political parties developing through various new ideologies. So, like socialism. And then finally, for those that are in the middle class or the upper classes, we see the effect of more leisure time. So this is where we get the creation of, city parks, sports clubs, different arenas for sporting events, public beaches, even department stores. Now you can mass produce clothes. We get museums set up and theaters and opera houses. So we start to see that art and culture will be impacted by the Industrial Revolution and all of this new capital as well. And that'll conclude our time today on the Industrial Revolution and the second wave of industrialization. Thanks for watching.